All right, we're live now. So, as you guys know, over the last couple of days, I have been constantly responding to biblical um, misinformation, ill-educated folks, and people who just do not know how to go about looking for credible sources, credible information, and documentation that is available to the public for consumption. There is a gentleman by the name whom which I will not speak of because he is already as famous as is. Nobody needs to go to his page to look at his stuff. Nobody needs to know about this guy. There are hundreds of guys just like him who are just as ill-educated as he is. And I'm just doing a quick video to discuss one of the things that I think if he would have known about, if he actually would have been educated on this particular subject in the field of theology, he might not have lost his faith, just like countless of others of Christians who lost their faith. As you guys know, I'm not a fundamental evangelical Christian at all. Um, I'm probably what you would say more liberal in my theology, right? Or I guess some other Christians would label me liberal in my theology, but you guys know I'm a theistic evolutionist, Molinist, rationalist. So I take a very different approach on the scriptures than say a fundamental evangelical, radical Pentecostal Christian. And I've noticed when people come from these type of backgrounds, they're more likely to lose their faith, not because the faith isn't true, but because there is literally something wrong with the way they were brought up in the church. Somebody just now, and they replied to one of my comments, and they said this. They said, I did a short survey a few years back about ex-pastors turned atheists. I found 4 common causes. Number 1, ignorance and or lack of education. That is number 1. That is the number 1 reason why people lose their faith that this guy put on his list is because they don't have proper formal training in the field. This guy going around saying he's an ex-pastor. How are you an ex-pastor and you don't know anything about the Council of Nicaea? How are you an ex-pastor and you don't know about any other biblical theories that have to do with Genesis besides the younger creationism model? I mean, there's gap theory, there's the pre-Adamite view, there's just order of creationism in general, and there's all these different, models of creation besides the younger creationist view. Even John Hartnett's model, who's a younger creationist, is a more honest approach where you believe in an old universe but a young earth. So how this guy is going about getting his information and etc. is just plain nonsense. Number 2 on this list is these people come from a fundamentalist background. That is 100% correct. So a lot of times 1 and 2 on this list actually go together. Somebody could be a fundamentalist, but they could also be an ill-educated fundamentalist. Now, there are people who are like Pentecostals, younger creationists, etc. There are some actually educated younger creationists. They may not be educated as far as the sciences go on the age of the earth, right? But they may be educated when it comes to theology and history and etc. and all those other things. Number 3 is they are pushed into the role of leadership too early, usually in their teens. That is correct. This guy, I think all 3 applies to him. I think he was ill-educated. He came from a fundamentalist background, and I think he may have been pushed, or not think, from what he said out his mouth about what he claims to know, he obviously hadn't had any formal training in theology. I don't know if he actually does have some type of pastoral certification or license. He hasn't revealed that to the public. He says that he has it. I'll give him the benefit of doubt, and I won't say he's a liar. But whatever type of information he was given or field he was supposedly trained in, they did not do a solid job in training him. And number 4 is sexual misconduct. And so the four common causes of pastors losing their faith and becoming atheists is because of ignorance, lack of education. They come from a fundamentalist background. They're pushed into the position of leadership too early. And number four, sexual misconduct. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And all of those four causes that this guy cited are spot on. With that being said, I want to get into divine inspiration, what it is and what it is not. A lot of Americans and just a lot of people in general all around the world have a very weird concept of what they think divine inspiration is. They think divine inspiration is when an ancient person who wrote the scriptures, who writes any inspired text or any holy book, they're sitting down in their kitchen one day eating whatever people hundreds of years ago used to eat, because they certainly didn't have waffles and bagels and pancakes. They're sitting in their kitchen eating breakfast, and one day the hand of the Lord just comes upon them and they go into a trance or vision and they start writing. But they're not really writing. It's this being, this deity, this divine thing writing for them. And then a couple hours later, they wake up out of their trance, look down on the piece of paper in front of them, and then they say, did I write that? That is not how inspiration works, at least if you're not a Muslim, because Muslims tend to think of inspiration exactly like that, i.e., hence Muhammad. With that being said, inspiration does not work like that, especially biblical inspiration. The biblical authors were not forced somehow to write down what God wanted them to write down through a trance or a vision. That's not how it works. God providentially guided these people to write down what he wanted them to write down to a certain people at a particular time. God did not force these people to write down what they wrote down, and he didn't alienate their way of thinking, their way of life, and or their culture so they could write down what he wanted them to write down. So God did not download onto them 21st century knowledge and then they wrote down 21st century things in their book and gave it to their first century audience. You know why? Because if God would have done that, the first century people who these authors had to communicate the text to, they wouldn't understand. They didn't have words for physics or quantum mechanics or evolutionary genetics or gravitational lensing. These were first century ancient people who did not know about the things we know today. The Bible is an ancient book. And so when we look into the Bible and it has ancient science in it, we should not be surprised, because that is not what the Bible was intended for. You don't get mad at your dog for not being a cat, because that is not what your dog was intended for. You don't get mad at your cell phone for not being a baseball. You don't get mad at your laptop for not being a wallet. You don't get mad at your BlizzTax for not being lotion. These things are not intended for that. The Bible was specifically intended to convey the message that God created the universe, which was 13.8 billion years ago. He had a divine incarnation. He placed himself into the system, i.e. Jesus Christ, died on the cross for our sins, resurrected, and will be back again. That is the conveying message, the point of the Christian. That is the message God has been trying to convey to people for over the last 2,000 to 3,500 years. If you do not understand that the Bible was not intended to be a science textbook, there obviously is something wrong with your way of thinking and not the way of thinking of the people who wrote the book. You know why? Because we shouldn't expect first century people to know about 21st century things. In the same way that in the 21st century today, people in the 22nd, 23rd, 24th, 25th century ahead of us will look back at us and they'll think how primitive and how silly our beliefs, our sciences, what we know to be true today, because civilizations advance over time. And so, in my view, I don't think we should actually look back and be arrogant and smirk and make fun of these ancient people. Neil deGrasse Tyson is good for that. He's good for laughing and joking at people who wrote the Bible, people who of certain things that we know of now today. And that's wrong. You know why? Because without those ancient people and their flawed understanding, we wouldn't have been able to build off of their flawed understanding of the world and evolve on top of that. Do you guys not know that actually chemistry comes from alchemy? Or do you guys not also know that the reason we even have Big Bang cosmology today, right, in astrophysics, is because we built off of the flawed understanding, the flawed worldview, the flawed cosmology of ancient Near Eastern cosmology. So we should actually thank these people for their mistakes, for them at least trying to get a right view of reality, because if it weren't for their flawed mistakes and us building off of it today, we wouldn't have the sciences and the resources and the knowledge we now have. We should thank our lucky stars that we had people back in those ancient days to at least try. And as far as the Bible is concerned, the Bible is not a science book. That's not what it was made for. God used a specific people at a specific time to write down what he wanted them to write down providentially every step of the way. And guess what? It's still divine inspiration, because it's God prompting these people to write down what he wanted them to write down. Therefore, the Bible is still divinely inspired, whether or not the science in the book is correct or not, because that was not the intended purpose for the theological book. With that being said, I'm signing off. You've been listening to my thoughts and my rants on divine inspiration. Feel free to subscribe, share this video around with ill-educated folks around you. And until next time, good night and good luck.